If she understands a single sentence of Korean tonight, I'll pay her a year's salary. The words landed on the white tablecloth like a challenge nobody expected to hear. For a moment, even the soft music drifting through the private dining room seemed to fade. Crystal glasses reflected the warm glow of the chandeliers overhead. Expensive watches rested beside folded linen napkins. Around the table sat investors, executives, and international guests whose combined net worth could buy entire city blocks. Then came the laughter. Not loud at first. Just a few amused chuckles. Then more joined in. Richard Sterling leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who had spent decades being the most powerful person in every room he entered. The 62-year-old millionaire wore a charcoal suit tailored so precisely it looked sculpted onto his frame. A gold watch peeked from beneath his cuff. He smiled as though he had just delivered the perfect punchline. Across the room, Maya Johnson stood silently holding a polished silver tray. Her black server uniform blended into the elegant surroundings so completely that most guests barely noticed her presence. That was normal. People saw the tray before they saw her. They noticed the wine before they noticed the person carrying it. Maya lowered her eyes and continued pouring sparkling water into a crystal glass near the end of the table. The movement was steady, professional, unhurried, as though a millionaire had not just turned her into the center of a joke. One of the Korean executives exchanged an uncomfortable glance with another guest. A few smiled politely. Others looked away. Nobody challenged Richard. Nobody ever did. The private dinner occupied the top floor of one of Manhattan's most exclusive hotels. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city stretching endlessly below, glowing beneath the deep blue sky of a spring evening. Yellow taxi lights moved like rivers through the streets nearly 40 stories down. Inside, however, all attention remained fixed on the table. Richard lifted his wine glass and gestured casually toward Maya. "No offense," he said. "I'm just being realistic." More laughter followed. Maya continued moving between guests, collecting empty glasses. Her expression never changed. She had learned years ago that dignity often sounded quieter than pride. The conversation shifted back toward business, at least on the surface. But every few minutes another guest glanced toward her. Some curious, some embarrassed, some simply waiting to see what would happen next. Richard seemed especially pleased with himself. He had spent the evening impressing a group of Korean investors, whose company was considering a major partnership. Every story he told grew larger than the last. Every success sounded more impressive than the one before. Confidence surrounded him like a spotlight. Then something happened. One of the Korean executives sitting near the center of the table leaned toward his colleague and quietly spoke in Korean. A second executive answered. A third joined the conversation. Their voices remained low, almost hidden beneath the soft music and clinking glasses. Most guests ignored it completely. Richard certainly did. He continued talking about market forecasts and investment opportunities. But across the room, Maya froze for the briefest moment. Just a fraction of a second. Barely noticeable. Her hand tightened slightly around the tray. Then she kept walking. Calm, professional, invisible. Yet something in her eyes had changed. Because unlike everyone else in that room, Maya Johnson understood every single word they were saying. The conversation in Korean lasted less than 30 seconds, but it stayed with Maya long after she walked away from the table. She carried a tray of empty glasses through a pair of polished service doors, and into the quiet hallway beyond the dining room. The sounds of laughter immediately became muffled behind the thick walls. Stainless steel counters reflected bright overhead lights. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen nearby. Maya set the tray down carefully and released a slow breath she did not realize she had been holding. One of the other servers looked up from a beverage station. "You okay?" she asked. Maya offered a small smile. "I am fine." It was the same answer she always gave. The server nodded and returned to work. Maya reached for another tray and checked the dining room orders clipped to a board near the entrance. Her hands moved automatically. Years of restaurant work had trained her to stay calm no matter what happened around her. Difficult customers, long shifts, unexpected problems. She handled them all the same way. Quietly, professionally. Yet tonight felt different. Not because of Richard Sterling. Men like him existed everywhere. People who assumed they understood someone after looking at them for 5 seconds. Maya had met plenty of those. What stayed in her mind was the Korean conversation she had overheard. Not because it was secretive, because it was important. One of the executives had sounded concerned. Another had sounded cautious. They were discussing details that clearly mattered to the business deal, unfolding inside that private dining room. Details that Richard seemed completely unaware of. Maya picked up the tray and pushed through the service doors again. The dining room looked even more impressive after a few moments away. The city lights beyond the windows sparkled like scattered diamonds across the darkness. Crystal stemware glowed beneath golden light. Expensive suits and elegant dresses surrounded the table. Everything looked perfect. Yet Maya knew appearances could be deceiving. She approached the table and quietly replaced several water glasses. The Korean guests continued speaking among themselves from time to time. Their voices remained respectful and measured. Maya understood every word. She had spent nearly 6 years studying the language. First through online courses, then through university classes, then through a semester abroad that changed her life. She remembered arriving in Seoul at 20 years old with 2 suitcases, a scholarship, and almost no money. She remembered studying late into the night while working part-time jobs to cover expenses. She remembered professors correcting every pronunciation mistake until perfection became habit. Most importantly, she remembered promising herself that no knowledge was ever wasted. Back then she believed language could open doors. Tonight it felt more like it revealed what people tried to hide behind them. Richard raised another glass and continued entertaining the room. Every story centered on his achievements. Every conversation seemed to orbit around him. Across the table, however, the Korean executives appeared increasingly distracted. One of them glanced down at documents on a tablet. Another exchanged a look with his colleague. A third quietly shook his head. Maya noticed all of it while appearing to notice nothing. Then one sentence caught her attention so sharply that her steps nearly stopped. The senior executive spoke in Korean, his voice low enough that nobody else reacted. If he signs tomorrow without understanding the revised conditions, he will lose control of the entire partnership. Maya felt a chill travel down her spine. The room remained warm. The chandelier still glowed softly overhead. Richard Sterling was still smiling. Yet suddenly the evening no longer felt like a harmless display of arrogance. It felt like the beginning of a mistake that nobody in the room could see coming. For the next several minutes, Maya tried to focus on her work. She refilled glasses, cleared plates, delivered fresh tea to guests seated around the long table. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Yet the sentence continued echoing in her mind. If he signs tomorrow without understanding the revised conditions, he will lose control of the entire partnership. The words carried weight, not because they sounded dramatic, because they sounded factual, careful, deliberate, the kind of statement experienced executives made when discussing risks they fully understood. Maya approached the beverage station near the wall and placed a bottle of sparkling water onto her tray. Her eyes drifted toward the tablet one of the Korean executives had been reviewing throughout the evening. She could not see the screen clearly from where she stood, but she recognized the body language. Concern, uncertainty, caution. Meanwhile, Richard Sterling appeared completely relaxed. He laughed loudly at another story and lifted his glass toward the guests. The investors responded politely, but their smiles seemed thinner now, less confident. Something beneath the surface was shifting. Maya noticed because she had spent years studying more than language. During college, she had also completed courses in international business. Not enough to become an executive, not enough to impress people like Richard Sterling, but enough to recognize when people around a negotiation were no longer discussing opportunities and had started worrying about consequences. She remembered sitting in crowded classrooms while balancing 2 jobs. She remembered nights when she studied until 2 in the morning because she refused to waste the scholarship she had fought so hard to earn. Most of her classmates eventually moved into corporate careers. Maya's path had been different. When her mother became ill 2 years earlier, she returned home to help care for her. The plans she once had were placed on hold. Tuition bills became medical bills. Internship applications became restaurant shifts. Life moved in directions she never expected. Yet she never stopped learning. Even now, language books filled the small apartment she shared with her mother. Every free hour became another lesson, another skill, another chance to prepare for opportunities that might one day return. The dining room doors opened briefly as a manager entered carrying several folders. He placed them beside Richard and quietly stepped away. Richard barely glanced at them. One of the Korean executives did. His expression tightened immediately. Maya noticed. Then came another exchange in Korean. Faster this time. More serious. The senior executive lowered his voice. The younger executive responded with visible concern. Maya listened while appearing focused on arranging glasses. The revised agreement had apparently been delivered only hours earlier. Certain control provisions had changed. Voting authority, decision rights, partnership oversight. Technical terms flowed through the conversation. Maya understood enough to realize the issue was significant. Richard, however, remained completely unaware that the discussion was even happening. Then the senior executive said something that caused Maya to stop breathing for half a second. He still believes the original structure is in place. Another executive nodded. Then tomorrow will be a surprise. A quiet silence followed. The kind of silence that carried more meaning than words. Maya looked toward Richard. The millionaire was smiling again, confident and comfortable beneath the warm chandelier light. Around him, guests listened attentively. He looked like a man who believed he controlled every outcome. Maya tightened her grip on the silver tray. Part of her wanted to ignore everything she had heard. After all, she was a server. Nothing more. Nobody had asked for her opinion. Nobody expected her to understand these conversations. Nobody even imagined she could. But another part of her remembered something her professor in Seoul once said. Knowledge creates responsibility. Once you understand something important, pretending you do not becomes its own decision. Maya slowly looked back toward the table. Tomorrow's meeting was less than 12 hours away. And for the first time all evening, she began wondering whether staying silent might become the biggest mistake in the room. Maya tried to walk away from the thought. She really did. For the next 10 minutes she focused on simple tasks. Replacing silverware. Refreshing tea. Clearing dessert plates from a nearby table. Yet every time she turned away, the conversation returned to her mind. The revised conditions. The loss of control. The assumption that Richard Sterling did not understand what was waiting for him tomorrow. The more she thought about it, the more uneasy she became. A server's job was not to interrupt business discussions. It certainly was not to interfere in negotiations involving people worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The rule was simple. Be invisible. Make guests comfortable. Leave the decisions to those sitting at the table. Maya understood that rule better than anyone. She had lived by it for years. Yet knowledge has a strange way of refusing to stay silent. The dining room had grown quieter as the evening progressed. Outside the windows, Manhattan glowed beneath a blanket of deep blue darkness. Headlights streamed along distant avenues. Helicopter lights blinked against the horizon. Inside, coffee service had begun. Maya carried a tray lined with white porcelain cups toward the table. The aroma of fresh roasted coffee drifted through the room. Richard accepted a cup without looking at her. His attention remained fixed on the guests seated across from him. The senior Korean executive glanced toward Maya briefly. Then he returned to the discussion. She wondered if he realized she understood every word. Probably not. Nobody ever did. She began placing cups around the table. One by one. Steady hands. Careful movements. Professional silence. Then she heard another sentence. Tomorrow's signature will finalize everything. Maya swallowed. Another executive responded. After that, there will be no way to reverse it. The words settled heavily in her chest. She finished serving the last cup and stepped back. Her heart beat faster than it should have. Not from fear. From conflict. She remembered her professor in Seoul standing before a classroom packed with students from 12 different countries. The professor had spoken in Korean first, then English. Knowledge is valuable only when used with courage. At the time, the phrase sounded inspirational. Tonight it felt uncomfortable. Because courage often came with consequences. Maya moved toward the service station near the entrance. She placed the empty tray down and stared briefly at the polished metal counter. Her reflection stared back at her beneath the bright lights. A server uniform. Tired eyes. Long shift. Nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged anywhere near a corporate negotiation. She could already imagine the reactions if she spoke. Confusion. Disbelief. Embarrassment. Perhaps even anger. People like Richard Sterling had spent years being listened to. People like Maya had spent years being overlooked. A manager passed by carrying paperwork. "Everything all right?" he asked. Maya nodded automatically. Yes. The answer came easily. Too easily. Because everything was not all right. Inside the dining room, the conversation continued moving toward tomorrow's agreement. Richard looked increasingly confident with every passing minute. He smiled. Laughed. Raised another toast. Maya watched through the partially open doorway. Then, she noticed something unexpected. One of the younger Korean executives did not look comfortable. He kept glancing at the documents beside him. His expression carried concern rather than confidence. For the first time, Maya realized something important. This was not a trap being celebrated. It was a misunderstanding being ignored. The distinction mattered. Suddenly her decision felt less like interfering and more like preventing a mistake. Her pulse quickened. The doorway seemed farther away than before. The room felt quieter. She took a slow breath. Then another. Around her, servers moved between tables. Glasses clinked softly. Coffee steamed beneath warm lighting. Nobody noticed Maya standing perfectly still. Nobody knew she was about to do something that could cost her job before the night was over. Finally, she picked up a fresh pot of tea and started walking toward the table. This time, however, she was not approaching as a server. She was approaching as someone who knew something everyone else had missed. Maya reached the table and began refilling teacups one final time. The polished silver pot felt heavier than before, though she knew it was only her nerves. Around her, the dinner continued as if nothing unusual was about to happen. Richard Sterling sat comfortably at the head of the table, speaking about expansion plans and future opportunities. The Korean executives listened politely. Some nodded. Others glanced occasionally at the folders resting beside them. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls. Somewhere below, Manhattan moved through another ordinary evening. Up here, however, Maya felt the weight of a decision that could not be undone. She finished pouring tea into the final cup. Then she stopped. Not for long. Just enough for several guests to notice. Richard looked up first. His expression carried mild annoyance, the kind reserved for interruptions he did not expect. Maya felt every eye in the room shift toward her. The silence arrived gradually. One conversation ended. Then another. Soon the entire table seemed suspended between curiosity and confusion. Maya took a careful breath. "Sir," she said respectfully. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Yes." Her heart pounded against her ribs. Every instinct told her to walk away. Every rule told her to remain silent. Yet the words came anyway. "I believe there may be something important about tomorrow's agreement that you should know." For a moment nobody reacted. Then a few guests exchanged puzzled looks. Richard blinked slowly. "Excuse me." Maya kept her voice calm. "I overheard part of the discussion regarding the revised conditions." A short laugh escaped from one end of the table. Another guest smiled awkwardly. Richard leaned back in his chair. "You overheard the discussion?" His tone was not angry yet. It was worse. Amused. "Yes, sir." The room grew still again. Richard glanced toward the executives beside him. "And you are telling me that my legal team, my consultants, and my business advisors have missed something, but my waitress has discovered it?" A few guests chuckled. Maya felt heat rise into her face. She remained standing. "I am only suggesting that some of the revised provisions deserve closer attention." Richard smiled broadly. "Do you even understand what they were discussing?" More laughter followed. The question hung in the air. Maya knew exactly what everyone expected. An apology. A retreat. An embarrassed excuse. Instead she answered, "Yes, sir. I do." The laughter stopped. Not completely, but enough. Richard studied her for several seconds. "And how exactly would you understand a private discussion conducted entirely in Korean?" Maya hesitated. Not because she lacked an answer, Because she knew what would happen once she gave it. Because I speak Korean. A silence settled over the table so suddenly it felt physical. Richard stared at her. Then he laughed again. Louder this time. Several guests joined him. One investor nearly shook his head. The response seemed absurd to them. Impossible. Richard lifted his glass. You speak Korean. He repeated the words as though testing them for humor. That is what you want us to believe. Maya nodded. Yes, sir. Richard looked around the room. A grin spread across his face. The same grin he wore whenever he felt completely in control. Well, he said, placing his glass on the table. This evening just became much more interesting. The Korean executives exchanged curious glances. The senior executive folded his hands and watched quietly. Richard leaned forward. If you truly understand Korean, prove it. The room became silent once more. Crystal glasses gleamed beneath the chandelier light. Coffee steam curled into the air. Every eye remained fixed on Maya Johnson. And for the first time all evening, nobody in the room saw a server standing beside the table. They saw a question waiting to be answered. The silence stretched for several long seconds. Nobody reached for a glass. Nobody checked a phone. Even the server standing near the wall seemed frozen in place. Richard Sterling rested both hands on the table and studied Maya with open skepticism. The confidence in his expression had not faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. He clearly believed the next few moments would end exactly the way he expected. All right, Richard said finally. Let us hear it. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Several guests leaned forward in anticipation. Maya remained calm. The silver teapot rested quietly in her hand. Her breathing slowed. Her shoulders relaxed. Strange as it seemed, the moment felt familiar. Not because she had ever stood in front of a room full of millionaires, but because she had spent years being underestimated. Years of watching people decide what she could or could not do before she ever spoke. The senior Korean executive looked at her carefully. Unlike the others, he did not appear amused. His eyes carried curiosity instead. Richard turned toward him. Would you mind helping us? The executive nodded politely. Richard gestured toward Maya. Ask her anything you would like. A few guests smiled. One investor crossed his arms confidently. Another quietly shook his head as though the outcome had already been decided. The executive spoke. His Korean was clear, formal, and rapid. Several sentences flowed together. The room listened without understanding a word. Maya listened too. Then she answered immediately. Not in English. In Korean. Her pronunciation was crisp, natural, effortless. The reaction was subtle at first. One executive blinked. Another sat straighter in his chair. Richard's smile weakened slightly. Maya continued speaking. The exchange lasted nearly 30 seconds. Questions, answers, clarifications. The rhythm felt smooth and comfortable, like two professionals discussing a familiar topic. The room remained silent except for their conversation. Then the executive asked a more complicated question. Maya answered again without hesitation. This time she even smiled briefly at part of his remark. A few of the Korean guests quietly laughed. Not at her. With her. Richard's expression changed. Only slightly. But enough. The certainty that had filled his face moments earlier began to crack. He glanced around the table as though searching for confirmation that everyone else was seeing the same thing. The executive asked another question. Maya responded. Then another. And another. Each answer arrived naturally. No pauses. No uncertainty. No sign that she was struggling. The room felt different now. The laughter from earlier had disappeared completely. Crystal glasses remained untouched. Coffee cooled in expensive cups. Beyond the windows, New York continued glowing beneath the night sky, unaware that an entire room had just shifted direction. Finally, the executive leaned back and smiled. It was the first genuine smile he had shown all evening. He spoke directly to Maya in Korean. She answered softly. Then he turned toward Richard. She did not simply understand my questions, he said in English. She answered them with a level of fluency that many business professionals never achieve. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Richard stared at Maya. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. The senior executive was not finished. In fact, he continued, her Korean is excellent. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Several guests exchanged surprised glances. Maya remained standing exactly where she had been all along. Same uniform, same tray, same calm expression. Yet somehow everything had changed. Because the room was no longer asking whether she spoke Korean. Now they were wondering what else they had been wrong about. The room remained quiet long after the senior executive finished speaking. Nobody seemed eager to break the silence. Richard Sterling looked down at the table for a moment, then back at Maya. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was no longer centered on him. It had shifted, not through force, not through argument, through something far more unsettling. Evidence. Maya stood calmly beside the table, offering no celebration and no sign of triumph. She had proven what she said. Nothing more. One of the investors cleared his throat softly. Another adjusted his glasses. Across the table, the younger Korean executive exchanged a brief glance with his colleagues. The atmosphere had changed completely. Richard finally leaned forward. Where did you learn Korean? He asked. His voice was noticeably quieter than before. Maya answered honestly. I studied it in college. Then I continued studying in South Korea during a scholarship program. Several heads turned. The information seemed to surprise people almost as much as her fluency. Richard stared at her for a moment. You lived in South Korea? Yes, sir. For how long? Almost a year. The senior executive smiled faintly. That explains a great deal. Richard slowly nodded, though his expression suggested he was still processing everything he had learned during the past few minutes. Then Maya made a decision. The entire reason she had spoken up returned to the front of her mind. Language had never been the point. The agreement was. She glanced toward the folders resting beside several guests. Sir, she said carefully. Richard looked up. There is something else. The room grew quiet again. Maya chose her words cautiously. Earlier this evening, I overheard part of a discussion regarding tomorrow's partnership agreement. Richard's expression tightened slightly. The younger Korean executive lowered his eyes toward the documents. Maya continued. I believe there may be confusion regarding the revised conditions. Nobody interrupted. Not this time. Richard folded his hands together. Go on. Maya looked toward the senior executive before speaking. The discussion suggested that certain decision rights and oversight provisions were modified in the latest version. Several guests exchanged glances immediately. The younger executive shifted in his chair. Richard's attention sharpened. And Maya took a breath. And it sounded as though the final structure may not match the assumptions being used during these discussions. The silence that followed felt heavier than any before it. Richard slowly turned toward the Korean executives. The younger executive looked uncomfortable. The senior executive remained calm. Finally, Richard reached for one of the folders and opened it. Several pages rustled beneath the soft chandelier light. Another executive opened a copy of the same documents. The room transformed from a dinner into a boardroom in less than 10 seconds. Maya remained standing quietly. Nobody laughed now. Nobody questioned whether she belonged in the conversation. Eyes moved rapidly across pages. Notes were compared. Clauses were reviewed. Then something happened. Richard stopped turning pages. His jaw tightened. He looked back at one particular section and read it again. Across from him, another investor had arrived at the same discovery. The younger Korean executive slowly exhaled. The senior executive lowered his gaze. Nobody needed to explain what had happened. The expressions around the table said enough. Richard looked up from the document. This time there was no trace of amusement in his face. Only realization. The revised provisions were there. Exactly where Maya believed they would be. The room had spent the evening focused on a waitress who supposedly could not understand Korean. Meanwhile, the most important information in the room had been hiding in plain sight. And somehow, the only person who noticed both was standing beside the table holding a silver teapot. No one spoke for several moments. The only sounds came from the faint hum of the city beyond the windows and the quiet rustle of paper as a few guests continued reviewing the documents in front of them. Richard Sterling remained seated, staring at the same page. The confidence that had dominated the evening was gone. In its place was something far rarer. Reflection. He read the clause again. Then once more. Finally he closed the folder and rested both hands on the table. Around him the mood had changed completely. What began as a private dinner now felt like a lesson nobody had expected to receive. Maya stood quietly beside the table. She had not moved. She had not attempted to draw attention to herself. In many ways, she looked exactly as she had at the beginning of the evening. The same uniform. The same silver teapot. The same calm expression. Yet nobody in the room saw her the same way anymore. The senior Korean executive broke the silence first. Miss Johnson was correct. His voice was measured and professional. The revised language deserves additional review before any signatures take place. Several guests nodded immediately. One investor removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another closed his folder and leaned back slowly. Richard looked toward Maya. For a moment he appeared ready to speak. Then he stopped. Whatever words came to mind seemed inadequate. The room waited. Finally he stood. Chairs shifted softly across the carpeted floor. Maya looked up. Richard took a few steps around the table until he stood directly across from her. The distance between them was not more than a few feet. Earlier that evening, the difference between their positions had seemed enormous. A millionaire and a waitress. A man everyone listened to and a woman nobody noticed. Now the contrast felt much smaller. Richard looked at her for several seconds before speaking. "I owe you an apology." The words landed gently but carried enormous weight. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. "I made assumptions about you," he continued. "I judged you before I knew anything about you." Maya listened quietly. Richard glanced briefly around the room. "And because of that, I nearly ignored information that could have affected an important decision." The room remained silent. There was no discomfort in the silence now. Only honesty. Richard reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. A few guests immediately remembered the challenge he had made earlier in the evening. He removed a checkbook and placed it carefully on the table. The gesture drew attention from everyone nearby. He began writing. Several seconds later, he tore out the check and turned it toward Maya. The amount was exactly what he had promised. $100,000. Richard held it out respectfully. A promise is a promise. Maya looked at the check. Then she looked at him. For a moment nobody seemed to breathe. The city lights reflected softly against the windows behind them. The silver teapot remained warm in her hand. Finally Maya smiled. Not a triumphant smile. Not a victorious one. Simply a kind smile. "Thank you, sir," she said. "But that is not why I spoke up." Richard paused. Maya glanced briefly at the documents resting on the table. "I spoke because it was the right thing to do." The words settled over the room like quiet rain. No one challenged them. No one could. Richard slowly lowered the check. The senior Korean executive smiled. Another guest nodded thoughtfully. In a room filled with wealth, influence, and status, the most valuable thing anyone had offered all night had cost nothing at all. It was integrity. And somehow, the person with the least power in the room had demonstrated the most of it. The evening ended differently than anyone had imagined. The folders remained open across the table. Conversations continued, but their tone had changed. The urgency was gone. The arrogance was gone too. In its place was something quieter. More careful. More thoughtful. Additional reviews were scheduled. Attorneys would examine the revised language before any signatures took place. What might have become a costly misunderstanding had been stopped before it ever left the room. Yet as important as the business outcome was, it no longer felt like the most significant thing that had happened that night. Maya returned to her responsibilities. She cleared coffee cups, collected empty glasses, refilled water when needed. The same task she had been performing all evening. But every interaction felt different now. Guests who had barely noticed her earlier suddenly thanked her by name. Several offered warm smiles. One investor shook her hand before leaving. Another wished her success in whatever came next. The senior Korean executive spoke with her briefly near the doorway. Their conversation remained private, conducted partly in Korean and partly in English. When it ended, he bowed his head respectfully before departing. Maya returned the gesture with equal respect. Near midnight, the dining room began to empty. The city outside still glowed beneath thousands of lights. Reflections shimmered across the glass walls. Staff members quietly reset tables for the following day. The elegant room that had been filled with tension only hours earlier now felt peaceful. Maya carried a final tray toward the service area. As she reached the doorway, a voice stopped her. "Miss Johnson." She turned. Richard Sterling stood alone beside the windows overlooking Manhattan. His jacket was draped over one arm. The folders were gone. The guests had already left. For a moment neither spoke. Then Richard looked out across the city below. "You know," he said quietly, "I have spent most of my life believing I could read people." Maya listened. Tonight proved otherwise. The reflection of city lights moved across the glass beside him. Richard smiled faintly. Not the confident smile he had worn earlier. Something gentler. More honest. "I saw a uniform and assumed I understood your story." Maya looked toward the skyline. Countless lights stretched into the distance. "Most people do," she said softly. Richard nodded. "That is their mistake." The words hung between them. Simple. True. He reached into his pocket and removed a business card. This time there was no dramatic offer. No public announcement. No attempt to impress anyone. He simply placed the card on a nearby table. "If you ever decide you want a different opportunity, call me." Maya glanced at the card. Then back at him. "Thank you." Richard nodded once. Nothing more needed to be said. A few minutes later, Maya stepped into the elevator and began the long ride down to the lobby. The doors opened onto polished marble floors and quiet hallways. Outside, cool spring air greeted her as she walked onto the sidewalk. The sounds of New York surrounded her immediately. Distant traffic. Passing conversations. The hum of a city that never truly slept. Maya paused for a moment beneath the glow of a streetlight. In her bag rested the same language notebook she carried everywhere. Its pages were filled with handwritten notes, vocabulary lists, and goals for the future. She opened it briefly before heading toward the subway entrance. There was one sentence written near the front. A sentence she had copied years ago while studying abroad. "Knowledge opens doors. Character decides what you do after they open." Maya smiled softly, closed the notebook, and continued walking. Behind her, the lights of the hotel shined against the night sky. Ahead of her, the city stretched endlessly forward. And somewhere between those two worlds, the quiet dignity that had carried her through the evening remained exactly where it had always been.